If you grew up with nice parents who weren't absolutely bad to you, congratulations. You are one of the luckiest people out there. Stop reading this and go hug them, call them, tell them you love them. Do whatever you can to show your appreciation while you still have the chance. Because once they're gone, all you're left with are memories and the haunting question of what could have been different. But if you weren't one of those lucky people, then my story might as well sound familiar. The kind of familiar that sits heavy in your chest, that makes you nod along with a bitter understanding that some childhoods are stolen before they even have a chance to bloom. I am Damien. Today, I'm the owner of a development company. We build houses and office buildings, structures that are meant to last, meant to shelter families and dreams. There's something poetic about that, I suppose. A man who lost his foundation so young, now spending his life creating foundations for others. But that's getting ahead of myself. This story doesn't start with success or redemption. It starts with a 6-year-old boy who had no idea that one perfect summer day would be the last normal day of his life. I am my mother's oldest biological child, though I wouldn't learn the full weight of that distinction until much later. When I was 6 years old, the world still felt infinite and safe. Summer stretched endlessly ahead, filled with the simple pleasures that make childhood golden. Swimming in the lake, catching fireflies at dusk, the promise of ice cream and baseball games with Dad. That particular day in June started like any other. The sun was already climbing high when my friends knocked on our door, their voices carrying the excitement that only comes with the first real heat of summer. "Come on, Damien, we're going to the lake." We stayed until the sun began its descent, until the older boys packed up their fishing gear and our lips turned blue from the cooling water. I walked home with wet hair and sand between my toes, already planning tomorrow's adventure. The day felt complete, perfect in its simplicity. But perfection, I would learn, is fragile. My father had come home from work that afternoon with plans. He'd bought a car recently, a sleek, beautiful thing that he'd been so proud of. I'd seen him in the garage on weekends, polishing every surface until it gleamed, reading the manual with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. He'd been waiting for the right moment to really take it out, to see what it could do on the open road. When he found out I wasn't home, that I was off swimming with friends, he made a decision that would haunt me forever. Instead of waiting, instead of postponing our planned ice cream run and trip to the baseball game, he called up some friends. He was proud of that car, excited to show it off, eager to share his joy with friends who would appreciate the smooth purr of the engine, the way it handled the curves. But excitement and inexperience make dangerous companions. He hadn't driven that particular car enough to understand its temperament, its weight, the way it responded to his touch on the wheel. The road that seemed so familiar in his old sedan became treacherous territory in this new machine. The crash happened on Miller's Bend, a curve that every local knew required respect. His friend later told us that Dad had been laughing, saying something about how smooth the ride was when they hit the curve too fast. The car that had been his pride became his coffin in the space of a heartbeat. I was still damp from the lake when I turned onto our street that evening, my flip-flops slapping against the pavement as I hurried home for dinner. But something was wrong. The familiar sight of our small blue house was marred by the presence of 2 police cars, their red and blue lights painting our quiet neighborhood in urgent, alien colors. My steps slowed, then stopped entirely. In the space between one breath and the next, I knew. Not the details, not the how or why, but I knew that the world I'd left that morning no longer existed. I found my mother in the living room, surrounded by uniformed officers whose faces were carefully composed masks of professional sympathy. The words that followed, "car accident, didn't survive, so sorry for your loss," became a blur of sounds that didn't quite make sense. But I understood the essential truth. My father was gone. The man who had promised me ice cream and baseball, who had been polishing his new car with such care, who had kissed my forehead that morning and told me to have fun at the lake, would never come home again. I thought, standing there in our suddenly foreign living room, that this was the hardest thing I would ever have to experience in life. the complete shattering of security, the sudden understanding that the people you love can disappear without warning, leaving only silence where their laughter used to be. But little did I know that the hard things were yet to come. Grief, I learned, doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't care about what other people think is an appropriate timeline for moving on. While I was still drowning in the absence of my father, still finding myself listening for his key in the door or saving up stories to tell him when he got home from work, my mother seemed to surface from her sorrow with startling speed. I grieved the loss of my dad with the intensity that only a child can manage, complete, consuming, without the adult ability to compartmentalize or rationalize. Every night, I would lie in my bed and replay memories of him like a movie reel I was terrified of losing. The way he hummed while making pancakes on Sunday mornings, how he'd ruffle my hair and call me sport when I showed him a drawing from school. The sound of his laugh, rich and warm, that could fill our entire house with joy. My mom recovered pretty quickly. Too quickly, if I'm being honest. I felt as if she didn't even feel she lost someone special to her. While I was still carefully preserving my father's memory like a fragile treasure, she seemed eager to pack it away and move forward. At 8 years old, I couldn't understand how someone could switch off love like flipping a light switch. How the person who had shared my dad's bed, who had promised to love him forever at their wedding, could seem so unaffected by his absence. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe she grieved differently than I did, quietly, in the spaces between her daily routines where I couldn't see. Maybe she was protecting herself the only way she knew how. But from where I stood, a confused, heartbroken little boy, it felt like betrayal. When I turned 8, barely 2 years after the worst day of my life, my mom remarried. His name was Kevin, and from the moment he moved his boxes into our house, I knew my world was about to change again. Not necessarily for the better. Kevin was everything my father wasn't. Where Dad had been gentle and patient, Kevin was loud and demanding. Where Dad had earned my respect through kindness, Kevin seemed to expect it as his due. He was a large man, not just in stature but in presence, the kind of person who filled a room the moment he entered it, leaving little space for anyone else. From the very first day, my stepdad tried to get me to call him Dad. The word felt wrong in my mouth, like trying to speak a foreign language I had no interest in learning. I didn't understand what was going on at first. At first, I thought he was trying to make sure we were close, that this was his awkward way of building a relationship with me. But as the requests became demands, and the suggestions became ultimatums, I figured he was just trying to erase my father. "Come on, Damien," he'd say, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness that adults use when they're trying to make something sound reasonable. "We're a family now. Families stick together. You can call me Dad." But little did he know that I already had so many fond memories of my father in my head. My real father. The man who had died trying to take me for ice cream in a baseball game. Kevin might have married my mother, might have moved into our house, might have claimed the title of head of household, but he couldn't claim the title that belonged to a dead man who would always be more of a father than Kevin could ever hope to be. I only knew of my stepdad as Kevin, and that's how it was going to stay. My mom and Kevin tried time and time again to get me to change how I addressed him. It became a constant source of tension in our house, this battle over a single word that carried the weight of my entire identity. They really wanted me to address them as Mom and Dad, but it was Mom and Kevin. Always Mom and Kevin. "It's disrespectful," my mother would say, her voice taking on that tired quality that meant we were about to have the same argument again. "Kevin is your father now. He takes care of you. He provides for you. The least you can do is show him the respect he deserves." But respect, I was learning, couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. And Kevin, for all his efforts to insert himself into the role my father had vacated, hadn't earned it. How could he, when every attempt felt like an assault on my dad's memory? Kevin wasn't my father, and I wasn't going to call him my father. This wasn't stubbornness or childish rebellion. It was the desperate act of a boy trying to hold on to the last connection he had to the man who had given him life, who had loved him unconditionally, who had died before they could finish all the conversations they were supposed to have. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, a cold war fought over dinner tables and in living room conversations, if not for the news that changed everything. It all came to a head when my mom got pregnant with my first sibling. The dynamics started to shift when my mom had a visible belly bump. Suddenly, I wasn't just the grieving stepson who refused to cooperate. I was the obstacle to their perfect new family. Kevin basically shielded me from getting some attention from my mom, as if my need for her love was somehow threatening to the life growing inside her. Every time I tried to be warm with her and hug her, Kevin would materialize like a guardian blocking access to something that no longer belonged to me. "Careful there, sport," he'd say, the nickname sounding wrong in his voice, nothing like the way my father had said it. "Mom needs her rest. The baby needs her to be calm." Or, "Why don't you go play in your room? Your mom and I need to talk about baby stuff." Or, "Not right now, Damien. Can't you see your mother is tired?" There was always an excuse, always a reason why my relationship with my mother, the last parent I had left, needed to be filtered through Kevin's approval. He positioned himself as the protector of my mother and their unborn child, which made me, by default, the threat they needed protection from. My mom gave birth to a baby girl they named Sarah. She was small and pink and perfect in the way that newborns are, and for a brief moment when I first saw her in the hospital, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe having a baby sister would somehow bring us together as a family. Maybe Kevin would soften now that he had his own child, and there would be room for all of us in this new configuration. I was wrong. It wasn't even 3 months since my sibling had come home when it was time for me to go ahead and move and get out. 3 months. 90-some days of watching Kevin hover over the baby like a guard dog, of seeing my mother transform into someone I barely recognized. The way it all played out was quite worthy of praise, sarcastically speaking. They'd orchestrated my removal with the precision of a military operation, complete with justifications and contingency plans for my inevitable resistance. My mom approached me first, her voice carrying that false sweetness that had become her default tone when she needed to deliver bad news. "Damien, honey, we need to talk." She sat me down in the living room, the same room where police officers had told me my father was dead, though I doubt she remembered that particular detail. "You're going to go live with your dad's sister, Aunt Lisa," she said, as if she were announcing a fun vacation rather than my exile. "It's going to be temporary, just until we get settled with the baby and figure out a better arrangement." Temporary. The word hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Even at 8 years old, I understood that temporary was adult code for permanent, but we don't want to deal with your reaction to that truth right now. I refused. Of course I refused. This was my home. This was where my father had lived, where his memory still lingered in the corners of rooms, in the way the morning light hit the kitchen window, in the creaky floorboard by the front door that he'd always promised to fix. This was where I belonged, where I had every right to stay. But my refusal was apparently the opening Kevin had been waiting for. "You see," he said to my mother, his voice taking on that reasonable tone that made my skin crawl. "This is exactly what I've been talking about. He's not treating this family like family. He doesn't respect us, doesn't appreciate what we're trying to do for him." Kevin brought up the excuse that I was being kicked out because I wasn't treating the family as family, as if calling him by his name instead of Dad was somehow grounds for eviction. As if my grief, my loyalty to my father's memory, my natural resistance to being replaced was evidence of some fundamental character flaw that made me unfit for their new family unit. Mom and Kevin were basically getting rid of me, and they'd constructed an elaborate justification that made it sound like it was my fault, like I'd forced their hand through my own behavior. "I'm not going," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "This is my house too. I live here." "Not anymore," Kevin said, his patience apparently exhausted by my continued existence. "Go pack your things. Your aunt is expecting you this afternoon." I didn't want to move. I refused. I planted myself on the couch and crossed my arms, the universal gesture of childhood defiance. I might have been only 8, but I understood that this was my last stand, my final chance to fight for my place in what used to be my home. But Kevin had apparently been waiting for this moment of resistance. He disappeared into my room and returned with one of my duffel bags, the one I'd used for sleepovers back when I still had friends, back when my life was normal enough for such things. He started throwing my things into the bag with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly planned this moment. Clothes, books, the few toys I still cared about, everything that made my room mine was being stuffed into that bag like evidence being collected from a crime scene. When I saw what he was doing, something inside me snapped. I ran to the bag and started emptying it, pulling out my belongings and clutching them to my chest like they were lifelines. "Stop it!" I screamed. "You can't make me go!" That's when Kevin got physical with me. It wasn't a slap or a punch, nothing that would leave obvious marks or give me a clear story to tell later. It was the kind of violence that adults can inflict on children while still maintaining plausible deniability. A grip on my wrist that was too tight, a shove that was too forceful, a way of using his size and strength to make it clear that resistance was futile. I looked to my mother, waiting for her to intervene, to protect me the way mothers are supposed to protect their children. But she only stared at me with her weirdly angry eyes and didn't even say anything. There was something in her gaze that I'd never seen before, not just anger, but resentment, as if my very existence was an inconvenience she could no longer tolerate. Instead of stopping Kevin, instead of defending me, she encouraged him. "He really needs a strong hand to listen to what adults are saying," she said, her voice cold and detached. "Maybe this will teach him that actions have consequences." In that moment, watching my mother side with the man who was physically forcing me out of my home, I realized that I had lost more than my father in that car accident 3 years ago. I had lost my entire family. The woman standing in our living room watching Kevin pack my life into a duffel bag wasn't the mother who had kissed my scraped knees and read me bedtime stories. She was a stranger wearing my mother's face, and she wanted me gone. I was 8 years old, and I was being evicted from my own life. The drive to Aunt Lisa's house felt like a funeral procession. The death of my childhood. The burial of any hope that my mother would change her mind and fight for me. But sometimes, when everything falls apart, the pieces land in places you never expected. Sometimes, what feels like the end is actually the beginning of something better than you ever dared to imagine. Aunt Lisa was now basically my new mom, though I approached this transition with all the wariness of a wounded animal. After what I'd experienced with Kevin and my mother's transformation, I wasn't about to trust any adult who claimed they wanted to take care of me. I wouldn't in a million years expect that she would end up being a real mother to me, the kind of mother I'd needed all along, the kind I'd lost when my father died, and my mother chose her new family over her old one. Aunt Lisa was my father's sister, and she carried pieces of him in her mannerisms, in the way she hummed while cooking, in the gentle way she ruffled my hair when I did something that made her proud. She never tried to replace my parents or make me forget where I came from. Instead, she honored my father's memory while creating space for me to heal. "You know," she told me on my first night in her small but warm house, "your dad used to sit in that exact same spot when we were kids, with that same stubborn look on his face. He was always the one who refused to give up, no matter how hard things got." Aunt Lisa already had a son, and I braced myself for the dynamics I'd experienced with Kevin and Sarah. The favoritism, the sense of being an unwanted addition to an already complete family. But my cousin Josh was nothing like I expected. Josh was around my age, just a few months older, and from the moment I walked into his room with my single bag of belongings, he treated me not like an intruder, but like the brother he'd been waiting for his whole life. "You can have the top bunk if you want," he said, as if sharing his space was the most natural thing in the world. "I've got extra comics under my bed, and Mom said we can stay up late tonight since it's your first day." Me and Josh ended up having the best bonding and relationship one could ever dream of. We became more than cousins, more than roommates sharing a small bedroom decorated with baseball posters and model airplanes. We were two brothers, two best friends growing up together, united by circumstance but bonded by choice. Josh never made me feel like the charity case, the kid whose own mother didn't want him. He included me in everything, his friend groups, his hobbies, his dreams for the future. When nightmares about my father's accident would wake me up crying, Josh would climb down from his bunk and sit with me until I could breathe normally again. When I struggled with math homework, he'd patiently explain the problems until they made sense. When I felt angry about my mother's abandonment, he'd listen without judgment, and then suggest we go throw a baseball until my rage exhausted itself. For the first time since my father's death, I felt like I belonged somewhere. But even as I was building this new life, the old one continued to fade away with systematic precision. My mom and Kevin went from messaging me almost every other day to once a week. The phone calls that had started as daily check-ins became weekly obligations, filled with awkward silences and questions that felt more like afterthoughts than genuine interest in my well-being. Then the calls became once every other week, then once a month, then sporadically, whenever guilt apparently struck my mother at random intervals. The conversations grew shorter, more superficial, until they felt like administrative check-ins rather than connections between a mother and her son. 2 years after I moved to live with my auntie and Josh, my contact with my mom and Kevin was down to almost zero. The relationship was basically non-existent, maintained only by the occasional birthday card that arrived a week late, and Christmas presents that felt like they'd been chosen by someone who didn't know me at all. The final confirmation of how completely I'd been erased from their lives came 10 years later. Let me just tell you that when I graduated high school, when I walked across that stage to receive my diploma, when Aunt Lisa cried in the audience and Josh cheered loud enough to embarrass me, when I achieved something that should have made any parent proud, they didn't even show up. The money they were sending Auntie to watch me had stopped when I turned 14. Not gradually, not with any warning or discussion, just stopped. Like turning off a faucet. 1 month the modest check arrived in Aunt Lisa's mailbox, and the next month, nothing. When she called to inquire, my mother's response was crisp and businesslike. He's old enough to contribute now. We've done our part. Their part. As if the bare minimum financial support for their abandoned child had been some magnanimous gesture rather than a legal and moral obligation. At that time, things weren't easy at Auntie's house. And with no more money from my parents, it even exacerbated the situation. Aunt Lisa worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and stocking shelves at the grocery store 3 nights a week. But it was never quite enough. The math was simple and cruel, 1 income supporting 3 people instead of 2, with no warning, no time to adjust or prepare. The changes were immediate and visible. We weren't getting the foods we were eating before. The name-brand cereals replaced with generic bags, the fresh fruit that had been our after-school snacks becoming a rare luxury. The snacks that we were eating before, the little indulgences that made childhood bearable, disappeared from our pantry. We were having to bring back and hold back a lot of things that we were doing. The baseball league fees that had seemed manageable before became impossible expenses. The school field trips that other kids took for granted became careful calculations of whether we could spare the money. Birthday presents became handmade crafts and heartfelt cards instead of store-bought toys. But here's what made Aunt Lisa and Josh different from every other adult who had claimed to care about me. They never complained about it. They never made a rude gesture about it. They weren't mean about it to me. They never blamed me for anything. Never made me feel like the burden I clearly was. Instead, they just went through it with me, facing the hardship as a united front rather than turning on each other when things got tough. "We're a team," Aunt Lisa would say when she saw me looking guilty about the sacrifices they were making. "Teams stick together, no matter what." Josh never once made me feel like his life would be easier without me there. When his friends went to movies we couldn't afford, he'd organize game nights at our house instead. When he had to give up his guitar lessons because the money wasn't there anymore, he taught himself from library books and never mentioned what he'd lost. Me and Josh ended up doing things around the house together, taking on responsibilities that most 14-year-olds never had to consider. We learned to cook actual meals instead of just heating up frozen dinners. We took over the yard work, the house cleaning, the small repairs that Aunt Lisa used to pay someone else to handle. We became partners in keeping our small household running, approaching each challenge with the determination of people who understood that failure wasn't an option. More importantly, we would also work together in different companies to make more money and bring in for my auntie. We started with odd jobs in the neighborhood, mowing lawns, raking leaves, shoveling snow in the winter. Josh had a natural talent for finding opportunities, and I had the stubbornness to see any job through to completion, no matter how tedious or difficult. I didn't see my mother often. I saw her only a few times in 7 years. Awkward encounters at public places where she'd agreed to meet me, usually with Sarah and my other siblings in tow, Kevin hovering in the background like a watchful prison guard. Sometimes I missed her with an intensity that surprised me, missed the woman she'd been before Kevin, before she'd decided that loving me was incompatible with her new life. I often called and said I wanted to visit, and also see my other siblings, desperate for some connection to the family that had once been mine. I wanted to know Sarah as more than just the baby who had displaced me. I wanted to meet the other children my mother had brought into the world, to be the big brother I'd always imagined myself being. And every time I was met with a no because I would not address Kevin as my dad. It always came back to that, the one word that represented everything I refused to surrender. There was once an instance in my sophomore year of high school that I still remember, and it's something that gets me every time I think about it. I remember calling my mom and asking her for $35 for a field trip. $35. The cost of a decent meal at a restaurant. Pocket change for most families, but for us it represented careful budgeting and sacrifice. I debated making the call for days, knowing that asking for money would give them power over me. But I was tired of being the only kid who couldn't participate in normal school activities. My mom listened to my request with that distant politeness she'd perfected over the years, then said, "Let me get Kevin on the phone." I should have hung up right then. I should have known that involving Kevin would turn a simple request into another battle over my father's memory. But I was 16 and desperate, and still carrying some foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd remember they were supposed to care about me. While on the phone with Kevin, he delivered his ultimatum with the casual cruelty of someone who knew exactly how much pain he was inflicting. "The only way you're getting $35 is if you call me Dad." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, asking for help with something as basic as a school field trip, and he was using it as leverage to force me to betray my father's memory. It wasn't about the money. $35 meant nothing to them. It was about breaking me, about finally winning the war of wills we'd been fighting since I was 8 years old. And at that moment, I broke down. The years of rejection, of financial struggle, of watching other kids take for granted the things I couldn't have, it all came crashing down on me. I was tired of fighting, tired of being strong, tired of protecting my father's memory at the cost of everything else. "Dad," I said, the word tasting like poison in my mouth. "Can you please give me the $35? There was a pause, and I could practically hear Kevin's satisfied smile through the phone. "Was it that hard?" he asked, savoring his victory. I waited for him to follow through on his promise, to give me the money I'd paid for with my dignity and my principles. Instead, he delivered the final blow. "No, you can't have it." "What?" The word came out as a whisper. "What was the point of me calling you?" Kevin's response was delivered with the calculated precision of someone who had been planning this moment for years. "If you can break that easily, I wouldn't want a son with this bad of morals." Then he hung up the phone. I sat there in Aunt Lisa's kitchen, holding the dead receiver, feeling like I'd been physically hollowed out. He'd made me betray everything I'd stood for, made me call him by the title that belonged to my dead father, and then he'd use that moment of weakness to justify rejecting me all over again. It was psychological warfare of the cruelest kind, designed not just to deny me what I'd asked for, but to destroy any remaining shred of self-respect I might have had. At that point, I didn't know what to do. The humiliation was crushing, But worse than that was the realization that I'd compromised everything I believed in for nothing. I didn't know how to tell my auntie. How could I explain that I'd begged my own mother for $35 and been rejected, not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually, completely? How could I admit that I'd called Kevin Dad, and it still hadn't been enough to earn even the smallest gesture of support? So I just lied and said I'd gotten the money. It was the last time I would ever ask them for anything. That night, lying in my bunk bed while Josh slept peacefully above me, I thought inside my head that I will never talk to these people again. It wasn't anger anymore, or hurt, or even disappointment. It was something colder and more final. The recognition that continuing to hope for love from people who were incapable of giving it was a form of self-torture I could no longer endure. But even as I made that resolution, I found myself breaking it over and over again. I used to always try to call to talk to my siblings, to see what was going on with their life. I wanted to know them, to have some connection to the family that shared my blood, even if they didn't share my experience. I wanted to be their brother, even if I couldn't be their mother's son. But as I would call and learn more, it became more frustrating. Each conversation was a window into a life I'd been excluded from, a reminder of everything I'd lost. There were so many things that I couldn't do, that I couldn't see, that I couldn't go to, so many field trips I couldn't attend, so many opportunities I couldn't access, so many experiences that were routine for them but impossible for me. My other siblings were able to do all these things because their family loved them, because they had parents who saw their needs as priorities rather than inconveniences. They got new clothes for school, went on family vacations, had college funds, while I had a growing awareness that my future depended entirely on what I could build for myself. I felt like I was watching my own family living a great life from afar. Few years went by, and something magical happened. What had started as desperate attempts to help Aunt Lisa pay the bills transformed into something neither Josh nor I had ever imagined possible. My and my cousin's business really started to take off, growing from a couple of teenagers with ambition into a legitimate enterprise that would change all our lives. We started off washing cars inside our general area, armed with nothing but determination, a few old sponges, and a garden hose. But we'd chosen our location wisely. Our neighborhood was lined with massive oak trees that, while beautiful, produced an almost supernatural amount of pollen. Cars parked outside looked like they'd been dusted with yellow snow within hours of being cleaned. There were a lot of trees that had a lot of pollen, so cars needed to be washed very frequently, sometimes twice a week during peak season. What had seemed like a natural nuisance became our golden opportunity. While other kids our age were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Josh and I were knocking on doors, building relationships with neighbors who initially saw us as just a couple of hard-working boys, but gradually came to rely on our services. We weren't just washing cars. We were solving a real problem that everyone in the area faced. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who'd become one of our regular customers, mentioned that her late husband's power washer was just sitting in her garage, gathering dust. "You boys have been so good to me," she said, pressing the keys into Josh's hand. "Maybe you can put this to better use than I ever could." With the money that we were making from washing the cars, we ended up getting our own power washer after Mrs. Henderson's generous loan proved how much more efficient and effective our service could be. But we didn't stop there. We added power washing to the car washing business, creating package deals that customers couldn't resist. So then we would power wash people's yards, their driveways, sidewalks, patios, and deck areas, and then wash their cars afterwards. The transformation was immediate and visible. Driveways that had been stained and grimy for years suddenly looked new again. Patios covered in mildew and dirt became inviting outdoor spaces. We weren't just providing a service. We were giving people their homes back, making them proud of their properties again. Sometime later, we got into landscaping. It wasn't deep landscaping. We didn't have the knowledge or equipment for major garden design or tree work, but we identified another gap in the market that we could fill with determination and attention to detail. We invested in a weed eater and started to do just the corners of people's lawns. the edges around flower beds, the areas where lawn mowers couldn't reach effectively. The results were dramatic. Those crisp, clean lines made every yard look professionally maintained, even if the homeowner did the basic mowing themselves. The neighborhood started to look so much better now. Not just individual houses, but the entire area began to have a sense of pride and care that attracted positive attention. Word spread the way it does in suburbia. The next neighborhood over asked us to come over and do some work there too. Then another, and another. We became their official lawn mowers, their go-to solution for outdoor maintenance that was reliable, affordable, and consistently excellent. The business slowly expanded, and with expansion came the need for help. We began to hire more people. First classmates who needed part-time work, then adults who were looking for steady employment with bosses who understood the value of hard work. What had started as a survival strategy had become something much bigger, a legitimate business that provided jobs for others and financial security for our family. We were no longer just trying to help Aunt Lisa make ends meet. We were building something that could support all of us for years to come. 9 years later, the transformation was complete. We were able to move my auntie to a new neighborhood and a new house. Not just any house, but the kind of home she dreamed about but never thought she could afford. It was a beautiful 2-story colonial with a large yard, a modern kitchen, and enough space for all of us to have our own rooms and privacy. More importantly, it was in a safe neighborhood with good schools, the kind of place where Aunt Lisa could walk to the grocery store without worrying about her safety. Me and Josh lived great and lavishly now. We could afford pretty much anything we wanted. New cars, nice clothes, vacations, technology, all the things that had seemed impossibly out of reach when we were 14 and counting every dollar. But perhaps more meaningful than the material possessions was the sense of security and possibility that success had brought us. We could make choices based on what we wanted rather than what we could afford. The business had grown beyond landscaping into property management and small construction projects. We had employees, contracts with commercial properties, and a reputation for excellence that brought us more work than we could handle. Recently, we decided to celebrate everything we'd accomplished. Me and Josh wanted to celebrate our success, and we took Auntie Lisa on a vacation. Not just any vacation, but a luxury cruise through the Caribbean. It felt surreal, sitting on the deck of a ship that cost more per night than we used to spend on groceries in a month, watching Aunt Lisa's face light up as she experienced luxuries she'd never dreamed of. We were sitting on the cruise ship's upper deck, enjoying drinks and watching the sunset paint the ocean in brilliant oranges and purples, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in years, but recognized immediately. My heart clenched. With an automatic response I thought I'd trained out of myself. It was my mom. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, paralyzed by the sudden intrusion of my past into what had been a perfect present. Somehow she had found out we were on vacation and how good we were doing. I picked up, but not with the hope or curiosity I might have felt years earlier. Instead, I felt a cold clarity, a protective distance that years of success and stability had given me. "I don't know who this is," I said, my voice steady and emotionless, "and I'll talk to you when I get home." And I hung up. It wasn't true, of course. I knew exactly who it was, and we both knew it. But the lie felt necessary, a way of establishing that the person calling was a stranger to me now, someone who had forfeited the right to interrupt my life with their sudden interest. We had a fantastic vacation with a bunch of do not disturb calls that I never answered. The cruise had been everything I'd hoped it would be. 7 days of watching Aunt Lisa experience luxuries she'd never dreamed of. 7 days of Josh and me celebrating not just our success, but the journey that had brought us here. We'd eaten at restaurants where the waiter brought you 7 courses you'd never heard of, watched shows that cost more to produce than we used to make in a year, and slept in a suite that was bigger than the bedroom Josh and I had shared for so many years. Eventually, we found ourselves back home, tanned and relaxed and full of stories we'd be telling for years. I was carrying my luggage up the walkway to our beautiful new house, still wearing the casual clothes of someone who'd been living without a care in the world when I saw her. She was sitting on our front porch like she belonged there, like she had every right to be waiting for us to return from a vacation she'd never been invited on. My mother, older now, grayer, wearing clothes that looked expensive but somehow desperate, like she'd put on her best outfit for this particular performance. As I got home, that's when I was approached by my mother, though approached makes it sound casual, coincidental. This was clearly planned, calculated, timed for maximum impact. She'd been waiting for us, probably watching the house, monitoring our social media, tracking our return like a predator studying its prey. "Oh my gosh, I love everything that you've been doing," she said, her voice bright with fake enthusiasm, as if we were old friends catching up after a pleasant separation rather than estranged family members meeting after years of silence. The words tumbled out of her like she'd been rehearsing them, polished and smooth and completely hollow. She gestured vaguely at the house, at my car, at the obvious signs of prosperity that surrounded us. "I can see that you have the amount of money to buy your auntie a house and take everyone on vacation. When are we going to see any of that? You have sisters and brothers and a mother that loves you and really needs to be taken care of." The audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. Here was the woman who had thrown me out of my own home at 8 years old, who had cut off financial support the moment I turned 14, who had hung up on me when I'd begged for $35 for a school field trip. And now, seeing that I'd managed to build something successful despite her abandonment, she wanted her share. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carefully controlled, despite the rage building in my chest. "What do you mean, loves and really needs to be taken care of?" I gestured toward the house where Josh and Aunt Lisa were probably unpacking, where the woman who had actually raised me was settling back into the home I'd been proud to provide for her. "My mother was on vacation with me," I said pointedly. "The woman who actually acted like a mother is the one who got to see the results of what I built." She immediately deflected, her tone shifting to that manipulative wheedling I remembered from childhood. "Don't be like that." "Don't be like what?" I shot back. "Don't be like someone who remembers what you did to me. Don't be like someone who has a functioning memory." The fake sweetness dropped from her voice as I continued. "I don't know if you know this, but I couldn't do a bunch of stuff that your kids got to do. I couldn't do the things I was supposed to do as a kid and worked my ass off with my cousin, because you didn't want me in your life. You and your significant other made that very clear." She tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. Years of suppressed anger and hurt were finally finding their voice, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into silence the way she had when I was a child. "You want to know when you're going to see any of this money?" "Never." "You want to know why?" "Because you gave up the right to benefit from my success when you decided I wasn't worth keeping." That's when she shifted tactics, pulling out what she clearly thought was her trump card. She went on to let me know that my stepdad had lost his job during the pandemic, and it had led him to be very depressed and very alcoholic. She painted a picture of a broken man struggling with addiction, as if Kevin's personal failures were somehow my responsibility to fix. "That has absolutely nothing to do with me," I said, my voice flat and final, "because I wasn't there. I didn't put anything in his hand. I didn't pour him any drinks. I didn't tell him to kick out your son. All of this isn't my fault." The words hung in the air between us, each one a nail in the coffin of whatever relationship she thought we might still have. "I don't know what makes you think that after all you've done to me, I am the one that has to fix things for you now. I'm not going to fix anything for you." She didn't want to hear that. She didn't want to hear any of that at all. The careful facade she'd been maintaining crumbled, and suddenly she was crying. Not the dignified tears of genuine remorse, but the desperate sobs of someone whose last-ditch manipulation attempt had failed. She started breaking down, saying that she was going to be homeless, that they were going to have nowhere to stay because Kevin still couldn't find another job. The tears were real, but they weren't tears of regret for how she'd treated me. They were tears of self-pity, of frustration that her abandoned son wasn't rushing to rescue the people who had made his childhood a nightmare. "Well, can you find a job?" I asked, the question so obvious that I couldn't believe I had to voice it. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, looking suddenly older and more fragile than I remembered. "I've been trying to find a job. It's just been hard." Man, I said, shaking my head at the cosmic irony of it all. Imagine how hard it was for a 15-year-old boy to realize that his parents are not going to help him out at all. You want to talk about hard? I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. Let me tell you about hard. Hard was washing cars while other kids were playing video games. Hard was listening to my siblings tell me about fun things they did that I wasn't invited to. She tried to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. I wasn't done. Hard was calling you for $35 for a school field trip and being told I had to call the man who destroyed our family dad, just to be denied anyway. The tears were coming harder now, but I felt no satisfaction in her distress. This wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth, spoken aloud for the first time in years. You know what else was hard? I said, my voice softening slightly. Building something meaningful out of nothing. Learning that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up. It's about being there when things get tough instead of running away. It's about loving someone even when it's inconvenient. I gestured toward the house again, toward the life I'd built with people who had chosen to love me. Aunt Lisa worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table when you stopped sending money. Josh shared everything he had with me without ever making me feel like a burden. They were there for every success, every failure, every moment that mattered. They earned the right to benefit from what I've built. My mother's face was a mask of desperation now, all pretense abandoned. But I'm your mother, she said, as if biology trumped behavior, as if the title meant something without the actions to back it up. No, I said quietly, the word carrying the weight of years of realization. You're the woman who gave birth to me. There's a difference. I walked past her toward the front door. You know your way off the property, I said without looking back. Don't come here again. After my mother left that day, I thought the matter was settled. I'd said what needed to be said, drawn the boundaries that should have been drawn years ago, and closed the door on a chapter of my life that had brought me nothing but pain. My cousin and auntie tried telling me that it was harsh, but that they were still blood. Josh approached it with his usual diplomatic nature, suggesting that maybe I was being too hard on people who were clearly struggling. Aunt Lisa, with the gentle wisdom that had guided me through so many difficult decisions, reminded me that forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about me, about not carrying anger that would only poison my own happiness. So they kept me on the fence for a while, presenting arguments I didn't want to hear but couldn't entirely dismiss. They pointed out that my mother's desperation was real, that Kevin's depression and alcoholism were genuine struggles, that my siblings, innocent in all of this, were suffering because of choices they'd never made. At some point, pity almost got into me and I almost relented. There were moments, usually late at night when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, when I'd remember being 8 years old and missing my mother with an intensity that felt like physical pain. But then I remembered everything again. The memories were like cold water, shocking me back to reality and reminding me that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt just because you miss what used to be on the other side. I wouldn't budge on my decision until Aunt Lisa played her ace card. It wasn't manipulation or guilt-tripping, just the simple request of a woman whose biggest heart had never steered me wrong. At least help them get a job, she said one evening as we sat on the back porch of the house. Not money, not handouts, just an opportunity to work for what they need. I looked at this woman who had saved my life in every way that mattered, who had shown me what unconditional love looked like, who had never asked me for anything except the chance to help me become the man I was meant to be. How could I refuse the first real favor she'd ever requested? So I relented, but on my terms. I ended up giving Kevin a construction job, not a management position, not something easy or prestigious, but honest manual labor with one of our crews. When he started working, showing up that first morning looking older and more broken than the man who had once wielded such power over my life, I made sure to remind him of the bad morals he had lectured me about once. Funny how things work out, I said, watching him lace up work boots that had clearly seen better days. Remember when you told me that if I could break that easily, You wouldn't want a son with such bad morals? Well, here we are. You're working for the son you didn't want, and I'm the one deciding whether you're worth keeping around." The words hung between us like a blade. Kevin's face went through a series of emotions: shame, anger, resignation, before settling on something that looked almost like humility. "I told him that I would never have helped him if it wasn't for Auntie, and that he should thank her," I continued, my voice steady and professional. "She's the only reason you have this opportunity. Don't forget that." He was humbled in a way I'd never seen before. The arrogant man who had once thrown my belongings into a bag and forced me from my home was gone, replaced by someone who understood that his survival depended on the mercy of the child he'd rejected. Kevin proved to be a decent worker, showing up on time, doing what he was told, keeping his head down and his mouth shut. I never made it easy for him, never let him forget the irony of our reversed positions, but I was fair. He earned his paychecks through sweat and labor, the same way I'd earned everything I had. My mother got a job too, eventually, working retail at a department store where she had to smile at customers and pretend their needs mattered. They weren't homeless anymore, weren't desperate, but they also weren't comfortable. They were surviving, which was more than they'd had any right to expect from the son they'd abandoned. I never spoke to my mother again after that day on the porch. Our entire relationship was now mediated through Kevin's employment. Professional, distant, transactional. It was fitting, really. My life goes on, fuller and richer than I ever imagined possible when I was that scared 8-year-old boy being forced out of his home. I'm living the dream in ways that matter, not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually. I have work that fulfills me, relationships that sustain me, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful from nothing. Most importantly, I'm taking care of my auntie that I call Mom, the woman who showed me that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about choice and love. Every day, I get to see her enjoying the security and comfort she provided for me when I needed it most. Every success feels sweeter because I can share it with the people who believed in me when believing required courage. Sometimes Josh and I will sit on the back porch of our beautiful house, watching Aunt Lisa tend to the garden she'd always dreamed of having, and we'll talk about how far we've come. From desperate teenagers washing cars to successful business owners, from a cramped bedroom with bunk beds to a house with enough space for everyone to have their own sanctuary. But the real measure of our success isn't in the money we've made or the property we own. It's in the family we've chosen and the love we've built together. It's in knowing that we showed up for each other when showing up was all we had to offer. The scared little boy who lost his father and was abandoned by his mother grew up to become a man who understands the difference between who you're born to and who you choose to love. And in the end, that makes all the difference.